Perhaps you can remember the very well-known phrase from the Declaration of Independence that says, all men are created equal. Setting aside the obvious issues with sexism, which wouldn't have been an issue in those days, but nonetheless we see today, all people are created equal. If that is indeed the case, if that's the principle or one of the founding principles of our nation and of our society, how is it that we can look at the way individuals live in today's society, from the wealthiest 1% who build elevators for their cars in their homes and run for president, to the most destitute of the poor, the homeless, who sleep on the streets and oftentimes can't get into shelters at night, even on very cold nights, and may go for days without food, who live in tents in the wilderness and who try to exist on a day-to-day basis. All people created equal in this society? It isn't likely. It isn't really what's going on. We may be created equal, but we're not starting out in life equally. One of the things that I think is important to understand when we begin to think about this disparity when it comes to equality is that the Declaration, I believe, was talking about social equality. And while there's a strong argument that says that socially socially we're not even equal in this society, if we were to just, for the sake of argument, accept that we all have a social equality in our culture, what we don't have, even in the face of that, is economic equality. When we talk about inequalities in our society, certainly I'm also talking about social inequalities, but more to the point, economic inequalities. And so we can have all the political rights and all the political freedoms that our society and the blessings of our democratic lifestyle can bestow upon us. We can be socially equal, but it really doesn't matter a whole lot if we don't have the capacity economically to live as equals as well. And so think about this and consider that when we talk about poverty, we're not necessarily talking about social inequality. We're really talking about economic inequality, and that's something that's very different. And I think most thinkers would be very hard pressed to argue that all individuals are created economically equal in this culture and in this society. To be poor in our society these days, I think the latest figure I heard was something like you make less than $30.50 a day. I think you live below the poverty line if you have that. Poverty just isn't really just even about not having enough money. It's really about having enough money to buy the things the society expects you to have. That can include things like cell phones and flat screen TVs even. Name brand tennis shoes if you're a high school student, those kinds of things. And so really think poverty isn't a simple concept, and it's something that I think you need to keep in mind as we go through this unit. I have some issues with some of the things that are put forth in this particular chapter, and this will become evident during the course of this discussion. We start with a question about who is poor in America, and here's some statistics that you're going to see over the next few slides that says that the United States poverty rate rose to the highest level in 11 years just a couple of years ago, and that really was around the time of the economic collapse that we're all familiar with in the late 2000 decade. Household incomes declined as the first full year of the recession took its toll. The poverty rate climbed in 2007, the year before that, and the number of people classified as poor jumped by over 2.6 million in that year, while the median household income fell by 3.6% to about $50,000. Many households would love to be at the median, by the way. Home values is, of course, one of the things that I think led the well, we didn't really have an economic collapse, but the economic recession of the last decade, home values fell for a number of different reasons that we won't go into in this class. It's really outside the parameters of our discussion, but stock prices also plummeted at the same time, and so a lot of people, if you were fortunate enough, that is, to have money in the stock market, a lot of people lost some money, and as you see here, is money in the trillions of dollars in household wealth since the middle of 2007. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that this economic recession, while it certainly took its toll on those individuals who are living below the poverty line for sure, it also took a big toll on some of those individuals who are relatively wealthy. And so there has been more of an interest in this and what caused it. Although Congress did very little, there was some efforts made to rein in Wall Street, I think, and to put some regulations on there, and some very popular consumer advocates such as Elizabeth Warren, who was elected to the United States Senate in 2012, I believe, have become very popular because of the fact that they're advocating for the consumers against Wall Street. But when you really look at the kinds of things, the practices and everything that has changed, I don't know that there is that much difference from what was going on prior to this recession, and very few individuals who were involved in that have paid any kind of legal consequences at all. So even after the recession ends, we expect the poverty rate is likely to continue. And remember that, as this slide indicates to you, children represent over 36% of the people who live in poverty, although they're only 25% of the total population. Now, there's a discussion about the culture of poverty, and this is a very controversial topic, and the textbook talks about Oscar Lewis more or less introducing this topic, this idea of the culture of poverty once again in 1998, but really culture of poverty goes back decades before that, and there was a discussion of the culture of poverty in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report, which interestingly was never really published, but was a report about poverty and what can be done about it. And Moynihan was looking at there was a lot of issues with Moynihan's conclusions, which also seemed to have some racist implications, as he was very critical of the typical African American family structure as he saw it at the time, which was largely matriarchal in structure, and that because of the fact that young black males would not stay with their families, that this poverty was created by the men themselves, and this was a part of this culture of poverty that developed. Well, it wasn't long before society, at least individuals who were thinking individuals, reacted to that and characterized it as blaming the victim. And nowadays, there seems to be some swing back towards this kind of thinking, although there may be some modification to the concept of the culture of poverty and what it's all about. And it's something we have to be very, very careful about this, because this particular explanation for poverty is becoming popular once again. Lewis says in his work, at least, that not all people who are poor live in a culture of poverty, but those who are poor who live in a culture of poverty have some of these characteristics as are listed here, that they have a strong feeling of being on the margins, of being helpless and dependent, of not belonging to society. This certainly is borne out, at least in some of the information that we have about who votes, because people who are in the working class and below that are less likely to vote than those that are in the middle class and the upper class. And so there is a sense that it doesn't matter really what they do or who they vote for, things aren't going to improve for them. And it's probably an accurate sense. And so why would there be much of a commitment to the political process if it doesn't work for you? They feel like aliens in their own country, convinced that the existing institutions don't serve their interests and needs. And there's a widespread feeling of inferiority and personal unworthiness. Little sense of history. They are a marginal people, according to Lewis, who know only their own troubles, their own local conditions, their own neighborhood, and their own way of life. They don't think beyond that, according to this culture of poverty theory. And so they have neither the knowledge nor the vision to see that their problems and others' problems in other places in the world can be considered very similar. Well, when the poor become class conscious or members of trade union organizations, they begin to adopt a more kind of wide-ranging view of the world, and they're really no longer part of the culture of poverty then, even though they may be still desperately poor. So the culture of poverty here is a way of thinking, is what Lewis is saying. And most people in the United States do find it difficult to think of poverty as a stable, persistent phenomena, because our economy keeps going through these growth periods and periods of times where it looks as, and right now in particular, we even after that great recession of the last decade, that we are optimistic about the economics in the future, and so poverty seems like something that really it doesn't. If it exists, it's only here for a little while. It's not really something that's very widespread in the minds of most people, but it really is quite widespread. Now, I did a little bit of digging around for some other information, and this is not from your textbook, these next few slides. This is really Galic giving you this information, but I kind of pulled this off of a website called an education website, ascd.org, and there was an article about the myth of the culture of poverty by a fellow by the name of Paul Gorski, and this is some of the alternate thinking about this that I would like to share with you and be sure that you're aware of and consider as we look at the causes of poverty. If you've taken Social Work 106 or Human Services 106 with me, the introduction to social welfare, you know that essentially the people who are poor in our minds tend to be divided between the worthy and the unworthy poor. And in the Glicken text, he quotes an author by the name of Samuelson, who in the late 1990s distinguished people in the culture of poverty from people in poverty by splitting the poor into two groups. The first group, that is the poor who are in the culture of poverty, lacks money because its members are disabled, unemployed, or perhaps being single mothers who've been widowed, divorced, or abandoned. So even though they're poor, they have middle-class values and can benefit from a variety of programs that help them out of poverty. The second group, according to Samuelson, is what he thinks is the true lower class, and these are people who see no value in working and no need for self-sacrifice or self-improvement. And so he believes that services of this group of poor are unlikely to change its members' conditions, even if their income were to be doubled. So, in fact, he says that increased benefits to the second group of poor Americans would probably lead to welfare dependence and not really improve their lives. It's a little bit like the old theory about, you can teach a man to fish, or you can give him a fish, but you're going to feed him for life if you teach him how to fish. Well, really, Samuelson's differentiation between the two types of poor here, those who lack money, have middle-class values but are disabled or widowed or whatever, and those who don't want to work, really is the same old differentiation between the worthy and the unworthy poor. And this is, while the conditions of these peoples, the reasons that they are in poverty may differ, we have to be careful to adopt that classification, that perception of poverty, because inevitably we begin to see the unworthy poor as unworthy. And as Samuelson's implying in his theory, that you can give them all the money you want to, it's not going to change their lives because it's their attitudes, it's that culture of poverty that's got them there. And I think that whole notion really kind of flies in the face of reality, or at least is very short-sighted and not very, prone to critical thinking, critical thought, I suppose. So Gorski says in his little piece on this website that the culture of poverty concept is constructed from a collection of stereotypes, no matter how false they may be, that these stereotypes have crept into the mainstream thinking, and now we don't even question these things, we just accept them as fact. And here are 4 stereotypes, and this is written for educators, and so there is an educational spin to this, but you can certainly apply this across many different kinds of venues. Poor people are unmotivated and have weak work ethics. That's one of the pieces of this myth of the culture of poverty. And again, Samuelson was talking about that. They don't want to work. They don't care to work. Poor parents are uninvolved in their children's learning because they don't value education. That's another myth, that poor people have no desire to see their kids rise above their circumstances. that poor people are linguistically deficient. They can't speak properly. They can't write correctly, so they'll never advance in an educated society. And that poor people tend to abuse drugs and alcohol. And studies indicate, for instance, some studies would tell you that it doesn't matter what your income level. As far as the use of drugs and alcohol is pretty much the same. And in fact, if you're wealthy, you're more likely to abuse alcohol, they say, as a group. And so probably it's rich people who are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol if you include those two groups together. So this myth of the culture of poverty distracts us from another dangerous culture that does exist, and this is the culture of classism. And this is, I think, this is something that's very important for social workers and human services workers to keep in mind. This culture, this idea, hardens in our schools and truly all over our society today, and leads to even the best of us having low expectations for low-income students and poor people. Worst of all, it really takes our attention away from what people in poverty do have in common, which is unequal access to basic human rights. This culture of classism, again, sort of characterizes and stereotypes this particular group of people as individuals who don't care to work, who don't care to get educated, and really don't want to do better for themselves. When really, it isn't so much about what they want to do. If they feel defeated and beat down, it may be because they've not been able to access the kinds of services and opportunities that other individuals have. Gorski goes on to talk about deficit theory, and he says this is the most destructive tool in the culture of classism and that way of thinking. In educational setting, this would be defining students by their weaknesses rather than their strengths. For social workers, of course, the corollary is very clear, defining our clients by their weaknesses instead of their strengths. Deficit theory has an attitude says that poor people are poor because of their own moral and intellectual deficiencies. This is the basic kinds of thinking that goes into the concept of the unworthy poor in social welfare. And it is this thinking that turns so much of America against the poor and thus against anti-poverty programs. This kind of thinking is supported by stereotypes and about individuals and poor individuals primarily, and also this theory is supported by us ignoring economic conditions like the inequitable access to high quality schooling that supports the cycle of poverty. Children who are living in inner city New York, for instance, or out in the hills of the poorest counties in West Virginia, let's say, or something like that, are highly unlikely to ever be able to go to an Ivy League university or to go to a university at all. It is much more difficult for those children to get into the schools to begin with, even if they can find the funding for it, because of the fact that their educational resources have been limited getting them there. There's a great disparity between the quality of high schools across the nation, depending upon what kind of neighborhood you live in. And so those who are wealthy really have a leg up, and those who are in well-to-do neighborhoods have a leg up in terms of their higher education, and that, of course, sets them up ahead of everyone else as they go through life economically as well. So the implications of deficit theory reach far beyond individual bias. If we convince ourselves that poverty results not from these inequalities, we're part of those inequalities, that they exist in society. So we can convince ourselves that it isn't about inequalities, but that it's really all about poor people's deficiencies. And so when it comes time for real anti-poverty programs and policies to be put in place, or some real efforts to make change to the system, we can step back and say it's not necessary, because it really is the poor person's fault. And so this deficit theory, Gorski says, and I believe is true, discourages us from change. A question in my 106 discussion boards oftentimes and could wind up being a question in this class again is, how do we end poverty? And I've almost gotten to the point where I scold my online students now before they even answer the question, and do not say that you can't end poverty because you're a social worker. And if social workers believe we can't end poverty, what's going to become of this world? we are the people that have to create this change. We have to help our clients advocate for this change, and we advocate for changes in policies. And big changes are going to be necessary for poverty to end. It can change. Will it is another thing, but it can if we develop the will for it to occur. So anyway, again, as this slide says, this is where Herbert Gans writes an article about the uses of poverty that we read in my introduction to sociology class. In fact, and he refers to the undeserving poor, and this is the unworthy poor. That's that segment of our society that doesn't deserve a fair shake, and that's what develops from this notion of the culture of poverty. And so I caution you, when you read about this and you think about the implications, I'm a little surprised really that I find this in this textbook kind of put there matter-of-factly, and really not a lot of disagreement or questioning about this. It just is a little distressing to me in this textbook. And so this is the first time I've thought of this text, and I will be using it again, I think, for the next few rounds at least. But this is one piece that doesn't impress me. When Bill Clinton got elected president in 1992, I think it was, he promised to change welfare as we know it. And long story short, through his administration, there was a big conservative backlash to some of his efforts to institute a national health care program in the first 2 years of his administration, 93 and 94, and so. In the midterm elections in 1994, the Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich and a number of other individuals, very conservative thinkers, overtook Congress and began to pressure society to change in terms of many different ways, and very unfriendly to individuals who live below the poverty line, very unfriendly to social welfare clients and social welfare programming. For instance, what they called the contract with America that the Republicans were trying to put in place in the second half of Clinton's first administration included things like, reducing welfare payments, and if families couldn't afford to support their children, then we would just put their children in orphanages. Well, first of all, we don't have orphanages anymore, but beyond that, we have children's homes and things like that, but to maintain children in out-of-home care is just extremely more expensive than it is to maintain them in their own homes with their parents. And so it isn't about money. That's not the thing that was motivating this if they were really looking at it. And it wouldn't surprise me really if they didn't look at it. But if they did, they know it's not about money. They're not going to save money doing that. This is about, it's about the anti-clients and anti-poverty kinds of attitudes and things that existed. And so in any event, Bill Clinton, being the politician that he was, understood that his politics needed to shift back to the center more, and so he kind of signed on to this Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996, complaining as he signed it, by the way, that this isn't really what he wanted, but it's he'll sign it for now, and we'll go from there. Well, this was really this was the welfare reform, the welfare to work program that was implemented in the mid-1990s. It ended the AFDC program that was established during the Roosevelt administration and replaced it with a program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, referred to as TANF. In Alaska, the TANF program is ATAP, Alaska Temporary Assistance Program. So it says the welfare assistance is no longer an entitlement program now, and what that means is that there are limitations placed on individuals receiving welfare assistance. Included in that is time limited, that no one can receive public assistance. No one can receive public assistance for more than. For one thing, benefits are time limited and are closely tied to work requirements. So no one now can receive public assistance for longer than 2 years at a time and 5 years maximum, according to these rules. And during this period of time, they're to be actively seeking employment or job training. And the idea is to get welfare recipients off of welfare and into the labor force. Well, as those of you, again, who took 106 with me know that getting women off the welfare rolls and getting women out of poverty are two entirely different concepts. Getting them off of welfare was fairly successful. The rolls were reduced all over the nation, but poverty rates continued to increase. The stated purposes of TANF included assisting needy families so children can be cared for in their own homes, which was sort of a response to, I think, the whole notion of taking poor children away from their parents was conjured up by this contract with America. Reducing the dependency of needy parents by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage. Job preparation, work, and marriage. Training, work, marriage. This is sort of the key principles of public policy when it comes to poor people. Get them trained, make them work, get them married, make them stay together. Out-of-wedlock pregnancies were to be prevented and reduced as much as possible, and two-parent families was sort of the picture of the day. So you get the idea here. Some pretty fundamental, I believe, religious kinds of attitudes were behind these requirements. And so some of the work requirements in the TANF program, they had to work as soon as they were job ready and no later than 2 years after coming on assistance. If they weren't working by that time, they could no longer receive assistance. Now, part of this was they had to work at least 30 hours a week. I think George Bush actually wanted to increase that. I don't think he did, but he wanted to increase that at one point. George Bush, that's George W. Bush. And then if they didn't fulfill these work requirements, they would have their benefits reduced or terminated. Individuals could be penalized could be penalized if they didn't have children under 6 years of age, but single parents with a child younger than 6 couldn't be penalized for failing to meet work requirements if they couldn't find adequate child care. And child care was a piece that was very critical here. Those of you that have children know that finding adequate childcare isn't the same thing as finding quality childcare either, and that's a scary proposition for many people. And while daycare assistance could be provided by the programs early on, that was something that would be phased out over time, and so people would go to work and ultimately lose that daycare assistance, perhaps if they made more money, as well as losing their health insurance that was available to their children with Medicaid if they go to work at a job without benefits. And really most of these women were going to those kinds of low-level, entry-level jobs that really didn't pay much and really offered very little in benefits. And so, again, getting them off the welfare rolls, not the same thing as getting them out of poverty. And you can see there were incentives given to the states for reducing their welfare caseloads. They would get credit that they could use, get some money that they could use in other programs and things like this. Here are the kinds of things that individuals who were receiving TANF, that the work requirements, these are the kinds of things they could do. You do see vocational training here. One thing you don't see is traditional college education. The jobs program, for instance, which was, I believe, the work program with the AFDC program immediately before TANF came into being, did allow its participants to attend college classes for credit for work. So again, it's an indication here that we have people that are being funneled in and channeled into certain areas that aren't necessarily going to give them the greatest opportunity to get ahead. This is one of these things about structural poverty. Families with an adult who received federally funded assistance for a total of 5 years were not eligible for cash aid under the TANF program in the future. I don't believe that included the children, for instance, so that I think kids could continue to receive assistance but not the parents. I may be wrong about that. And the states also had the option, by the way, to extend up to 20% of their caseload they could excuse from that 5-year limit, and it was up to the states to decide who it was that would be excused and for what reasons. If there was an unmarried minor parent, if they were to receive TANF, they were to be living in the homes of their parents or in an adult who could be responsible for them, and they had to stay in school and training activities. Provisions for bonuses, not for the clients now, but for the states, could be awarded if they had a high relative achievement on certain measures related to the goals and purposes of the TANF program. Reducing out of wedlock pregnancies, two-person marriages, blah 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 blah. So the states could get some money back and some rewards for reducing their welfare rolls and achieving some of those other goals of the program. TANF's been implemented, TANF through the Personal Responsibility Act that we talked about have been implemented, 10 years when these statistics come up? Okay, in 2004, an estimated 700,000 to 1 million adults were homeless in any given week, according to SAMHSA. I guess that's SAMHSA. And 2004, an estimated 3 million adults were homeless during the course of the year. These numbers increased when children were included to 5 million. SAMHSA estimated that 2 to 3% of the United States population, that's 5 to 8 million people, will experience at least one night of homelessness. 5 to 8 million people in the United States would experience at least one night of homelessness. And while that experience is short and often caused by natural disasters, that kind of thing, for others, it's quite different from that. But of those homeless, about 80% end their homelessness within 2 to 3 weeks. They find that they have personal, social, economic resources to draw on that people who are homeless for longer periods of time do not have. If you have kindly aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, children, parents, whoever it might be, they may get you off the streets for a while. They probably will. Not all of them will, but many of them will. But not everybody has those resources available to them. And it's not just family here we're talking about. They might have had some other resources, where involvement in a church, for instance, where the church could put them up or something like that. About 10% of the homeless are homeless for as long as 2 months. And another 10% are homeless for as long as 2 months, with housing availability and affordability adding to the time that they are homeless. That it repeats itself, doesn't it? I've been working through these slides actually, and I missed that somehow. So let me read that again. About 10% are homeless for as long as 2 months, with housing availability and affordability adding to the time that they're homeless. In other words, there is no housing out there, or they can't afford the housing that is available. And then another group of about 10% is homeless on a chronic, protracted basis, as long as 7 to 8 months in a 2-year period. Now, these are the people that truly are, I think, when we think of homeless, I think this is who we tend to think about the most. And usually disabilities associated with mental illnesses or substance abuse are often the reasons for homelessness for these people who are long-term homeless. In 1996, and this is actually the year that the Personal Responsibility Act was implemented, the median monthly income for people who were homeless was $300. The median monthly income for homeless people, $300. That is less, nowadays at least, that is less than what a minimum wage worker who works a 40-hour week would make in a week. So this is in a month. It's only 44% of the federal poverty level for a single adult. In other words, they are 44% short. They have less than half of the income for a single adult that would qualify them as poor, living below the poverty level. So they are destitute. We're talking destitute. HUD estimated 5 million households in the United States with incomes below 50% of the local median who pay more than half of their income to rent or live in substandard housing. So a lot of families, poor families, are living in very substandard housing, paying way too much for rent if they're not doing that. And individuals who are disabled who receive SSI, now this is different from Social Security disability, but SSI disability, oftentimes find it impossible to find affordable housing. So people become homeless because of untreated mental illnesses. The mentally ill, if you've ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's an example of a large hospital setting that the mentally ill also were often treated in the olden days, so to speak. And then somewhere in the 1960s and 1970s, a movement came about to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill, and those big, huge hospitals were, for the most part, closed down. And individuals, the federal government funded community mental health centers to tend to those individuals and keep them in their communities and provide wraparound treatment services for those individuals instead of having them in a hospital setting all their life. A much healthier arrangement for them, except that many of those individuals were not located by the mental health centers. Sometimes the mental health centers started working more with the middle class for a while. At least that was going on, and so case management of the mentally ill sort of became something that they weren't all that interested in. But for the most part, those community mental health centers did try to provide services, but many individuals refused to engage in those services, and so these individuals oftentimes wind up on the street. Substance abuse drains your financial resources and intrudes on your social relationships, and for substance abusing, whether it be alcohol or drugs, substance abuse among the homeless makes it very, very difficult to get out of that situation. And there are many other reasons: domestic violence, unexpected health care costs, release from jail and having no place to go. If you're a kid in a foster care system that hasn't had a adoption, aging out of foster care youth systems. Now, many of the states, including Alaska right now, are extending their care to these young adults up until their 22nd birthday in some cases, and providing them with some assistance in getting on their feet. But even still, at some point that ends, and oftentimes those kids go from care to prison or pregnancy. It seems, well, in my experience, the males oftentimes that aged out of foster care wound up in jail in a course of 6 months to a year, and the girls oftentimes wound up pregnant in the same period of time. Domestic violence, this is another big reason sometimes why people become homeless, and why it is sometimes that the question kind of in reverse is, why do women stay with abusers when they're being abused? It's because homelessness is the alternative oftentimes. So this is one of those big problems everybody says we're never going to be able to solve. And again, as social workers, we really have to take a different attitude about this. We need a system of safe and comfortable emergency shelters for people who are displaced because of natural and man-made disasters that have helping professionals on board who can offer counseling and supportive interventions and help these individuals get hooked up with their resources. We need to have the same kind of shelters in every community for the people who are poor and have been displaced from their homes, and where they can stay for an extended period of time until they're able to get the resources they need to get on their feet again and have their own housing. And to provide free or very inexpensive housing for people with disabilities who can't work, and really for those who are going to be among the chronically homeless for a longer period of time. Providing a livable income to the working poor in the form of a realistic minimum wage, health care, universal health care, and other services to permit them to function as healthy family units. Really, we're not talking about a realistic minimum wage. We're talking about a living wage. You can't live on minimum wage. You cannot certainly support a family on minimum wage, and it's probably unlikely you can support yourself on minimum wage. A living wage is the amount of money that's necessary to really be able to support yourself, and I think by most estimates, the living wage is, I think, more than twice the minimum wage in the nation right now. Free and inexpensive long-term housing to adults with children. However, this has been done in the past also through housing projects and those kinds of things in various communities that have been administered by the local governments, and those projects have become cauldrons of crime and social malfeasance, and because of the fact that services aren't in place, there isn't because the tax base is very low there, and so politicians lose interest in those communities, and oftentimes services are not put in place to help individuals in those situations. And so housing isn't the only solution. Housing with appropriate services is really what we need. provide more practice to keep children from becoming homeless as a result of disputes, abuse, and other emotional and social problems that could be prevented. Homelessness needs to become a national concern, and not only the government but also our private and charitable organizations should be engaged in trying to provide services here as well. And this slide says we need to outlaw poverty, and we'll more on that in a second. There's an article that you have read for me if you've taken other classes with me, and you probably will read again in this class later in the semester, by a writer by the name of Malcolm Gladwell. And he's a social commentator and a columnist that writes for, among other publications, I think the New Yorker magazine, and he's got several books out, and many of them are collections of shorter stories. And in one of those books, What the Dog Saw, is an article called $1 Million Murray. And in this article, he proposes a radical change in how we approach the homeless problem. And it really makes very good sense when you listen to it. But what we find is that when people read this article and think about the solutions that he's proposing, there's oftentimes a gut reaction that's negative to it. And just keep that in mind. If you haven't read it yet, you'll probably read it for me later this semester. And when you do, monitor how you react to it and ask yourself the reason for that reaction. So after the economic recession, I love the way this is worded, many otherwise intelligent and well-functioning people fell into serious financial difficulties because of their poor financial skills. And there was a lot of credit cards available, and so if you've ever been caught in that, you only have to pay a little bit now, and you can put it off till later, and the debt just increases and increases and increases because of interest rates. And so the Fed set policies to monitor credit card companies and to make sure that interest rates aren't changed without substantial warning, that they're capped at a realistic level. And actually, the Fed has encouraged banks to make home mortgages and credit cards more difficult to get. Watching, for instance, my young son come out of high school, not yet have a job, but be solicited as he walks into our local Wells Fargo bank to take a credit card when he has no income, boggles my mind. It's no wonder people get into financial problems that they get into. I talked to the bank about it too, and he's an adult by this time, so I can do nothing about it. And they're like, well, sir, it's a wonderful way for him to establish credit. He's got to establish his credit, yes, but he's going to establish bad credit if he doesn't have a job. How's he going to pay his credit card back? So people get into financial problems because they spend too much, save too little, carry too much debt, don't care enough about their financial future. Sounds like Congress. Sounds like me. It is in fact the plight of the middle class in many respects. We don't budget for emergencies. We use credit cards a lot of times to get us through tough times. And financial advisors tell us that we should save from 3 to 6 months' wages back in a savings account somewhere in case of an emergency. I can't imagine, having worked and continuing to work, while I may not be the best financial manager certainly in the world, it's hard for me to picture having 6 months worth of salary tucked away that I don't touch. Just hard to imagine. If you're starting out, maybe you should set that for a goal though and see what happens. Here are some statistics that suggest that increasing high school graduation rates reduce the amount of crime, serious crime like murders and assaults. That fewer crimes would be committed. It would save us lots of money in our society, and just even increasing law enforcement reduces crime also. So how can we make poverty illegal? Well, it's called a redistribution of wealth. Take the wealth that some people have and give to poor people so they can live decent, safe, and healthy lives. when the United States implemented, I think it was the 17th Amendment, perhaps the 18th Amendment in the early 1900s, that gave the government the right to collect an income tax. That gave the government, the federal government, the opportunity to redistribute income, to redistribute wealth, and our system is set up on a tax structure such that the more money you make, the higher your tax rate is. That's the theory behind it. In actuality, our system has so many loopholes that a lot of the wealthy people are paying, as I know you've heard, far less in tax in their actual income, percentage of their income, as do us poor people down at the lower end. And I say us poor people. I'm not poor, and I'm really not at the lower end, but I'm certainly not in the anywhere near wealthy. So middle class and below, we should be paying a lower tax rate than those who are wealthy, and yet percentage-wise, most of the wealthy have investment counselors that help them find ways around those tax loopholes and things. But one way to resolve this and to have money to redistribute to the poor is to close those loopholes and to raise the taxes on the wealthiest Americans, and something that President Obama has been wanting to do. Congress has been struggling against for the last several years. The argument against this redistribution scheme says that it removes incentive for people to make changes in businesses that lead them to become very wealthy. That if they're going to be taxed more, then why bother to innovate and those kinds of things. And it also says that redistributing the wealth discourages the poor people from working, because that's that unworthy poor theory that says that, the poor people really don't care to work, and in fact, you give them more money, they're not going to do any better with it. That's sort of that same kind of thinking. So others think that we keep taxes low in order to put more money out into the economy, and so new ideas and new ventures occur, and really, in doing that, we're going to have to keep the safety net as small as possible, also because we don't want to encourage people to become dependent on welfare, and we want to force people to work. Job training, education, work, and marriage, right? And there are countries, and I could talk for weeks on poverty, as you know, and I think you've gathered if you don't know, but there are countries all around the world that encourage the redistribution of wealth and have done so successfully. And Sweden is one of the examples of that, if you want to read about it. There are those who say Sweden hasn't done as well as the social welfarists want us to believe. But I believe you'll find when you really do some digging on it and everything that they found a way to kind of just redistribute wealth, and that's working well in their system. So the next few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about what social workers do to help move clients out of poverty. And I have to tell you once again that, this is what social workers do. This is what we often wind up doing, but this really is taking a micro intervention focus, which is, this class really is about micro social work roles, really much more than macro. So I don't see a lot in here about the kinds of things I would like to see, which is less about helping people adjust to poverty, or to get that training, education, and be free of out of wedlock pregnancies and get married. I'd like us to get away from that thinking and to really kind of think about changing the system. But this is what we have here. So we'll talk a little bit about what Glicken says we do, and we do. We help clients in a financial crisis get their full entitled financial health care, housing, child care benefits from public welfare programs. We help them do that. For some social workers and I'm not really sure they're social work trained, but some workers who work in public assistance programs, and that's what this sounds like, really what they think their job is to, it is their job to determine eligibility. It's not to help them get benefits. They're very different things there, very different things. We help clients receive retraining and additional education so they can get back in the workforce and get off of welfare. We provide support, encouragement, counseling when needed to help clients who are depressed or anxious to cope with the kinds of pressures that they have in their lives, whether it be with children or job training or other realities of life, to move them in the workplace. Now, this chapter is focused on poverty, and so we keep talking about getting people into the workplace. And you see how the author is subscribing to this notion that getting people working is going to resolve their problems with poverty. And I don't believe that. I think that will help, and it will get some people out of poverty, but it will not resolve the issue of poverty. It works with people who are poor. It's, again, a big difference. We help people to develop budgets. We help them get food stamps, to learn to use public transportation so they get back and forth to work. We help them find support groups with other people in poverty, provide support, encouragement, ideas that help them cope and remove themselves from poverty. Find low-cost housing, help them with their children, because of the impact that poverty has on children, and no surprise that the data suggests that children who live in poverty are at much greater risk for social and emotional problems. One thing I will say, we're not saying here that people who live in poverty are more likely to abuse their children, because they're not. But poverty does increase the kinds of stresses that contribute to things like child abuse and neglect. And so really then, by helping clients with children, workers often prevent social and emotional problems experienced by some of the children in poverty. This last item on this list is my addition to the list. It's not in the text, but social workers advocate for public policies that change the system so that poverty and unemployment are reduced. And really, I should have said eliminated there, shouldn't I? So I just want to tell you, we're teaching from this text, and Glicken's got a lot of great ideas, and I think he's a good writer, and I like his overall attitude about things. But I think his chapter really misses the point about poverty and what we should be doing as a profession. As individuals, these are the kinds of things that, if you're working with poor people, these are the kinds of things you're probably going to be doing. And it's okay to feel okay about doing those things, because your job is going to be to help individuals on a day-to-day basis cope with their lives and try to climb out of that situation they're in. But the bigger task is really to look at why they're there and not blame them for being there, but to help them figure out what pieces of the system they're being excluded from, what pieces of the system are keeping them there, and then help them find ways to challenge those pieces. And you yourself begin to advocate for political changes and economic changes and policy changes, institutional changes that help to reduce these inequalities so that economic equality can be the same thing as social equality. So that's all I have to say in this chapter. I've babbled on long enough, and hope that you find what I had to say useful, and as well as the material in the textbook. And if you have any questions or thoughts about this, please do let me know. Thank you.